Check 1, 2, check, check, check. 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 Check 1. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. Check 1, 2, check, check, check. We good? Cool.
Cops Director Hugh Clemens, and then we will take questions. In terms of questions, I will be seated here at the corner, and I will call on outlets when you raise your hand, and then I will call last question, and then that will be the end of the press conference. Okay? 2-minute warning.
Good morning. Last night I met with some of the survivors and the loved ones of the victims of the horrific mass shooting at Robb Elementary School. I came here to tell them that the United States Department of Justice has finished its critical incident review. In undertaking this review at the request of the then mayor, the Justice Department committed to using our expertise and independence to assess the law enforcement response to the shooting and to provide guidance moving forward. As I told families and survivors last night, the department's review concluded that a series of major failures in leadership, in tactics, in communications, in training, and in preparedness were made by law enforcement leaders and others responding to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary. As a result, 33 students and 3 of their teachers, many of whom have been shot, were trapped in a room with an active shooter for over an hour as law enforcement officials remained outside. I also told the families and survivors how deeply sorry I am for the losses they suffered that day and for the losses they have suffered every day since. I told them that the priority for the Justice Department in preparing this report has been to honor the memories of those who were taken from them. And I told the families gathered last night what I hope is clear among the hundreds of pages and thousands of details in this report. Their loved ones deserve better. The law enforcement response at Robb Elementary School on May 24, 2022, and in the hours and days after, was a failure that should not have happened. We hope to honor the victims and the survivors by working together to try to prevent anything like this from ever happening again, here or anywhere. I'm now going to turn to the key observations and recommendations of the report. On May 24, 2022 at 11:33 a.m., an active shooter wearing body armor and equipped with a high-power AR-15 rifle entered Robb Elementary School and began shooting into classrooms 111 and 112, which shared a connecting door. Within minutes, 11 law enforcement officers from the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District and the Uvalde Police Department arrived inside the school. Hearing continued gunfire, 5 officers immediately advanced toward classrooms 111 and 112. Within seconds, shots were fired from inside the classroom. Shrapnel hit 2 officers, and all responders retreated to cover. A single officer then made additional attempts to approach the classrooms, but after 11:40 a.m., no more attempts to enter the rooms were made until 12:48 p.m., more than an hour later. As a consequence of failed leadership, training, and policies, injured and scared students and teachers remained trapped with the subject in the classrooms, waiting to be rescued. Survivors later shared that they heard officers gathered outside the classrooms while they waited. The victims trapped in classroom 111 and 112 were waiting to be rescued at 11:44 a.m., approximately 10 minutes after officers first arrived, when the subject fired another shot inside the classrooms. They were still waiting at 11:56 a.m., when an officer on the scene told law enforcement leaders that his wife, a teacher, was inside room 111 and 112 and had been shot. They were still waiting as broadcasts went out on officer radios that a student trapped inside rooms 111 and had called 911 at 12:10 p.m. to say that that the student was in a room full of victims. That student stayed on the phone with 911 for 16 minutes. The victims were still waiting to be rescued when the subject fired 4 more shots inside the classrooms at 12:21 p.m., 49 minutes after officers arrived on the scene. And they were still waiting for another 27 minutes after that until finally officers entered the classroom and killed the subject. As the victims were trapped and waiting for help, many of their families were waiting outside the school, growing increasingly concerned about why law enforcement had not taken action to rescue their loved ones. Law enforcement officers from different agencies who had self-deployed to the scene in overwhelming numbers were themselves waiting for leadership decisions about how to proceed. Many officers reported that they did not know who, if anyone, was in charge, what they should do, or the status of the incident. Some officers were confused about why there was no attempt to confront the active shooter and rescue the children. Some officers believed the subject had already been killed, or that law enforcement was in the room with the shooter. 75 minutes after the first officers arrived on scene, officers finally entered room 111. The subject engaged the entry team with gunfire, and the officers responded with fire. 77 minutes after the first officers arrived on the scene, and after 45 rounds had been fired by the active shooter, the shooter was killed. The massacre at Robb Elementary shattered families throughout this community and devastated our country. 19 children and 2 teachers were killed, and untold numbers of students, teachers, and law enforcement officers were injured. The law enforcement response to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary was a failure. As the threat posed to our country by mass shootings has grown and evolved over the past several decades, law enforcement's response tactics have also changed. The massacre at Columbine High School 25 years ago, and the 47 minutes it took for law enforcement to enter that high school, marked a major shift in how law enforcement leaders think about responding to mass shootings. It is now widely understood by law enforcement agencies across the country that in active shooter incidents, time is not on the side of law enforcement. Every second counts. And the priority of law enforcement must be to immediately enter the room and stop the shooter with whatever weapons and tools officers have with them. That is the approach responding officers first employed when they arrived at Robb Elementary School. But within minutes of arriving inside the school, officials on scene transitioned from treating the scene as an active shooter situation to treating the shooter as a barricaded subject. This was the most significant failure. That failure meant that law enforcement officials prioritized a protracted evacuation of students and teachers in other classrooms instead of immediately rescuing the victims trapped with the active shooter. It meant that officials spent time trying to negotiate with the subject instead of entering the room and confronting him. It meant that officials asked for and waited for additional responders and equipment instead of following generally accepted active shooter practice and moving toward the shooter with the resources they had. It meant waiting for a set of keys to open the classroom door, which the report concludes was likely unlocked anyway. And it meant that the victims remained trapped with the shooter for more than an hour after the first officers arrived on scene. There were also other failures in leadership, command, and coordination. None of the law enforcement leaders at the scene established an incident command structure to provide timely direction, control, and coordination among the enormous number of responders who arrived on scene. This lack of a command structure, exacerbated by communication difficulties, contributed to confusion among responders about who was in charge and how they could help. These failures may also have been influenced by policy and training deficiencies at responding law enforcement agencies. Some lacked any active shooter training at all. Some had inappropriate training. Some lacked critical incident response training. And the vast majority had never trained together with different agencies. As Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta will discuss in further detail, the chaos and confusion that defined the law enforcement response while the shooter remained a threat also defined the aftermath of the shooting. For example, surviving victims, some with bullet wounds and other injuries, were put on buses without being brought to the attention of medics. Some families were told that their family members had survived when they had not. And victims, families, and community members struggled to receive timely and accurate information about what had occurred at Robb Elementary. The Justice Department's objective in preparing this report was threefold. First, to honor the victims, the survivors, and their loved ones. Second, to provide a clear and independent accounting of the law enforcement response to the horrific attack that devastated this community. And third, to provide law enforcement agencies and communities across the country with analysis and recommendations about how what happened at Uvalde should inform efforts to prepare themselves for and respond to mass shootings. Policing is a noble profession. It is also a hard one. It requires training and constant education about evolving threats. The report includes widely accepted recommendations that have been adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country about how to prepare for and respond to active shooter situations. Before an active shooter incident occurs, law enforcement agencies have a responsibility to ensure that their leaders and all their officers are trained to focus on rapid response, trained that the first officers on the scene must focus on eliminating the threat and protecting the victims most in danger. Law enforcement officers responding to an active shooter must be prepared to take charge, to establish a unified command, and to facilitate communications, operational coordination, and allocation and delivery of resources. They must continually assess and adjust as the incident evolves. And in the aftermath of a mass shooting, law enforcement and government agencies must provide the public with a sense of trust and confidence by communicating openly, clearly, and compassionately during a time in which many are learning the most devastating news that any human being can receive. The victims and survivors of the mass shooting at Robb Elementary on May 24th, 2022 deserve better. First and foremost, the 19 children and their 2 teachers who were stolen from their loved ones should be here today. They never should have been targeted by a mass shooter. We must never forget the shooter's heinous act that day. And the victims and survivors should never have been trapped with that shooter for more than an hour as they waited for their rescue. The families of the victims and survivors deserve more than incomplete, inaccurate, and conflicting communications about the status of their loved ones. This community deserved more than misinformation from officials during and after the attack. Responding officers here in Uvalde, who also lost loved ones and who still bear the emotional scars of that day, deserve the kind of leadership and training that would have prepared them to do the work that was required. Our children deserve better than to grow up in a country where an 18-year-old has easy access to a weapon that belongs on the battlefield, not in a classroom. And communities across the country and the law enforcement officers who protect them deserve better than to be forced to respond to one horrific mass shooting after another. But that is the terrible reality that we face. And so it is a reality that every law enforcement agency in every community across the country must be prepared for. No community and no law enforcement agency should have to face that threat alone. That is why we came to Uvalde, and that is why we are releasing this report. The Justice Department remains committed to working in partnership with communities across the country and with the law enforcement agencies working to protect those communities every day. In particular, we stand ready to help communities and agencies prepared to respond to a terrible incident like the one that occurred here. We have concluded the department's review, but we know that the work of healing here in Uvalde is only beginning. We are humbled and grateful to stand with this community as you remember and honor your loved ones. I will now turn the podium over to Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta. Her leadership has been key to the department's efforts to conduct an independent, fair, and comprehensive review of the horrific mass shooting of May 24th and its aftermath. I am also grateful to the entire Critical Incident Review Team and to the department's COPS office under the leadership of Hugh Clements for their tireless work. Vanita.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. It is hard to look at the truth that the law enforcement response on May 24th was an unimaginable failure and that a lack of action by adults failed to protect children and their teachers. But we cannot look away from what happened here. We cannot look away from these children, and we cannot look away from what happened in Uvalde. On May 24th, 2022, this community lost 19 beloved children and 2 cherished teachers at Robb Elementary School. In the days and weeks following, this community also lost a sense of faith and trust in their own neighbors and institutions as they tried to make sense of what happened on the 24th and were unable to get the answers they needed. During that time, the then mayor of Uvalde called me to ask the Justice Department to conduct an independent review of what had happened and what went wrong on May 24th and in the days that followed. Shortly after, the Justice Department began its review. The Attorney General just gave a sense of the detailed timeline that we have laid out and the cascading failures that occurred over the course of 77 minutes between when law enforcement arrived on the scene and when they finally entered the classroom. But we also know the pain and the failures and missteps did not end when law enforcement finally entered the classrooms and rescued the survivors. It continued at minute 78, when it became clear that because there was no leader, there was no plan to triage the 35 victims in classrooms 111 and 112, many of whom had been shot. Victims were moved away without precautions. Without appropriate precautions, victims who had already passed away were taken to the hospital in ambulances, while children with bullet wounds were put on school buses without any medical attention. In the commotion, one adult victim was placed on a walkway, on the ground, outside to be attended to. She died there. The reunification and notification process for families was similarly chaotic, and as some of the families described, truly deeply painful. During and after the 77 minutes, families and survivors received unclear and sometimes conflicting information about where to go to reunite with their loved ones. Many family members waited at the school for hours without status updates, not knowing where their children were, if they were safe or hurt, or even alive. Families searching desperately for their loved ones were sent to different places all across town: the high school, the civic center, the hospital. Some of these details are gut-wrenching. Families hearing about the need for autopsy results as the first indications that their loved ones may not have survived. At one point, hours after the shooting, an official incorrectly told families waiting for their children at the Civic Center that an additional bus of survivors was coming. It did not. Inaccurate and inconsistent public communications, including social media posts and press conferences, only made things worse. At 12:06 p.m., law enforcement posted on Facebook, reassuring parents that, quote, students and staff are safe in the buildings, close quote. That false reassurance was never corrected. An hour later, law enforcement inaccurately posted on social media that the shooter was in custody. That post, too, was never corrected. Both impromptu and scheduled news conferences and media engagements contained inaccurate, incomplete, and at times conflicting information. Mirroring the failures of the law enforcement response, state and local agencies failed to coordinate, leading to inaccurate and incomplete information being provided to anxious family and community members and the public. We also know the pain following a tragedy like this endures, and that the support this community needs has often been missing. And we cannot talk about what happened at Robb Elementary School without reckoning with the fact that this tragedy took place somewhere all children should feel supported and cared for and safe. Our report documents missteps in school safety preparation that contributed to this tragedy, including that the campus safety plan was effectively a template and included security measures that were not even available at Robb. That there was a culture of complacency around locked door policies with interior and exterior doors routinely left unlocked, and that confusion over where to find a master key to unlock classroom doors contributed to the significant delay in entering classrooms 111 and 112. As I made clear last April when I came to Uvalde to meet with families, and as we reiterated to families last night, this report not only looked backwards, but also identifies lessons learned and recommendations for other communities to prevent something like this from happening again. No law enforcement agency or community can assume that what happened here or in Newtown or in Parkland or in Columbine can't happen in their community. That is our reality. This report offers 273 recommendations for law enforcement agencies and other officials in every community. That includes a series of recommendations for law enforcement and government agencies preparing for and responding to mass shooting incidents and active shooter incidents as they occur. In the immediate aftermath of an active shooter incident, law enforcement leaders must continue to provide guidance and direction to all first responders, including triage planning to ensure that emergency personnel can access victims as soon as possible. Law enforcement and government officials must provide proactive, timely, and accurate information, notifications, and give community members as much information as appropriate at any given time to help avoid or mitigate rumors, uncertainty, and unnecessary worry. If an organization shares incorrect information with the public, it should be open about it and correct that mistake. In the days, weeks, and years after a devastating attack, survivors, the family members of victims, community members, law enforcement, and other first responders, and their families should continue to be offered both immediate and ongoing trauma support. The Justice Department remains committed to the Uvalde community. Federal Victims of Crime Act formula funds are being used to support victim services in Uvalde, and our Office for Victims of Crime is working with the state of Texas and the Uvalde community to complete the application for supplemental Justice Department funding that is going to enable continuing services for victims, survivors, and their families. And through our COPS office, the department has also awarded the local school district substantial funding over the past 2 years through our school violence prevention program to help this community continue to improve school safety and security. Before we started this review, we consulted with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to build out a team of experts, including several law enforcement leaders who have ably led their communities through mass violence events. I am grateful to those leaders who lent their expertise to us and to our COPS office team for their immense dedication and commitment. Together, the review team's work included reviewing more than 14,000 pieces of data and documentation, including policies and procedures, training logs, body camera and closed-circuit television footage, photographs, and more. They made 9 visits to Uvalde for a total of 54 days in this community. They conducted more than 260 interviews of individuals from more than 30 organizations and agencies, including responding law enforcement and survivors, family members, victim services providers, and school and hospital staff. They traveled throughout the country to review generally accepted practices and contemporary active shooter training courses. Other organizations and news outlets have documented parts of what happened on this horrific day. But all of this work has led to a Justice Department report that is both the most detailed and broadest in scope, looking beyond the immediate incident to include the communications, victim services, and school safety aspects of this tragedy, as well as the post-incident response and investigation and pre-incident planning and preparation. The public demands a lot from law enforcement, and we often take their service for granted. Every day, police officers run towards danger to keep people safe. In Uvalde on May 24th, 2022, that did not happen until far too late. Uvalde is a community that is healing, and getting clear on the facts is part of healing. So too are the beautiful, powerful murals all over the city commemorating each child and teacher killed on May 24th. And so too is enacting change in policies and practices to help make sure these failures do not happen again. While it took time for the Justice Department to examine the facts and put this report together, our commitment to the Uvalde community does not end here. Through available funding, resources, victim services, technical assistance, and training, we will support Uvalde and communities across the country in their efforts to prevent and address violence. Just as we have looked back, we will look forward. We are committed to honoring the memories of the lives that were lost here by working to build a future where all of our children, their loved ones, and their teachers can feel cared for, supported, and protected. I will now pass this to Hugh Clements, the director of our COPS office.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Attorney General and Associate Gupta. I know that nothing can take away the pain suffered by the families, the survivors, and the entire Uvalde community. But I do know that the team at the COPS office has been driven to provide an authoritative accounting of everything that transpired at Robb Elementary on May 24th, as well as the events leading up to it and an examination of what happened afterward. As someone with 38 years of law enforcement experience, and 12 of those as chief of the Providence Police Department, I know the importance of having the right policies in place, the right training, and the right partnerships, especially law enforcement partnerships with schools, communities, and other agencies and first responders. This report stresses the importance of those working relationships and how invaluable they are, especially when there's a critical incident. Of course, no one ever thinks something like this is going to happen in their community until it does, which is why the recommendations we provide in this report are so critically important. Unfortunately, the review of the mass shooting at Robb Elementary School is not the first critical incident review that the COPS office has conducted. But having done this before, we know the value of the information provided. Other critical incidents reviews that the COPS office has authored in the past include the reports on the terrorist shooting in San Bernardino, California, and the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. We heard from the agencies involved how valuable these reports were, and we know from talking to agencies across the country how they have incorporated the recommendations shared into their own planning. We have seen how vitally important preparation is, how important it is to have the right policies and procedures in place, how incredibly important training is, and how critical it is that agencies train together. Reviews such as this can be tremendously helpful and important to both law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve, as they work together to see how they can improve policies, procedures, systems, and most importantly, relationships. We talk about that and much, much more in this report, which I know is going to be a very important resource to law enforcement agencies in the months and the years to come. You will see in this report that the team has worked diligently in carrying out a number of critical steps, including developing a complete incident reconstruction, reviewing thousands of relevant documents, conducting site visits, and interviewing a wide variety of stakeholders. As I said, we know that nothing can take away the pain that this community has endured, but we were dedicated to providing this community with a transparent, independent, and thorough review of what happened. And I believe that this report has done just that. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Attorney General, you just described how this report documents profound failures by law enforcement, but the report also makes a point of withholding the names of all but the most senior law enforcement officials. Does this report sufficiently hold accountable the individuals responsible for failures?
So the report is an analysis of what happened at Uvalde, including by everyone at Uvalde, all responding agencies. It concludes that this was a failure of leadership, and so all members of the leadership who failed were identified. It also identifies individual officers by rank and by what agency they're from, but the standard practice of the Justice Department in these critical incident reviews is not to name those who are not listed as at fault, and particularly not to name those in lower ranks who acted on the scene.
Mr. Attorney General.
Case at 12.
I have two questions for you, Mr. Attorney General. Your report here names Pete Orlando and Mario Vargas as leaders in this incident that happened at Robb Elementary. Had they acted in the way that was put out as guidelines after the Columbine shooting, would lives have been saved on May 24th?
I think the report concludes that had law enforcement agencies followed generally accepted practices in an active shooter situation and gone right after the shooter to stop him, lives would have been saved and people would have survived.
My second question for you, sir, based on this report, we know at this point no criminal charges have been filed against anyone who responded that day. Based on what you all found in this report, should this Uvalde County District Attorney file any criminal charges with law enforcement officers who responded that day?
Well, I'm going to leave that question for the DA. Just to explain for everyone, the Justice Department only has criminal jurisdiction where federal crime has occurred. The shooter here is dead, and there's no federal criminal jurisdiction. What we've done is responded to the mayor's request, then mayor's request, for a critical incident response examination to determine the manner in which the agencies responded and to provide recommendations for the future, and that's what we've done.
Next question, Korean. Dr. Korean.
Mr. Attorney General, to identify one of the objectives of this analysis to provide law enforcement agencies which recommendations do you think law enforcement agencies should undertake to enforce the most
Yeah. So the most significant failure, and therefore the most significant and urgent thing for law enforcement to do, is active shooter training, which provides that when an active shooter is in a building or anywhere else, the first priority is to stop that shooter and to remove people who are immediately endangered by that shooter. And that requires tactical training. That's the first thing. Say the second thing is critical incident response. Establishing who's going to be the on-site commander, making clear to all other agencies that that person will be the on-site commander. That again requires training and practice and response.
Last, one more and then one.
Should joint training be mandated across the
I'm not sure what the word mandated here means. I think it's absolutely necessary that in any circumstance where there's going to be more than one agency responding, and that's going to be in any school situation, all the possible agencies should train together in order to establish lines of communication, command structure, and communications structure in particular. Here radios were not interactive. People did not have a way to talk to each other, and make sure that everybody's following the same strategy.
Last question, Uvalde Leader News.
Mr. Attorney General, some have suggested that our police response was typical on mass shooting, in fact, even better in many cases. And I used the Pulse nightclub event as a comparison. It took 3 hours to go in and put down that killer. And there were phone calls back and forth. How do you speak to that?
So actually, I'll let Hugh talk about specifically about the Pulse nightclub, but I will say that what I've described and what the report describes is clearly the generally accepted response to an active shooter. We did a survey across the country, and the experts who were involved in this examination are experts in exactly this subject of active shooter, and there's no doubt that the standard practice is the one I've described. And I'm going to let Hugh answer that specific question.
I would say honestly, I don't know if that's entirely true. I will tell you this report is comprehensive, it's extensive. I urge you all to read it, the executive summary, all hundreds of pages. I will say there was a epic, complete lack of leadership, unity of command. There was no incident command set up. That's not the case with the Pulse nightclub. And so in this particular one, in comparison, that is not entirely true, and the response was a failure of leadership.
Great, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
You have just been listening to the Department of Justice and the COPS Office talking about the newly released 600-page report that shows us so much more about the Uvalde massacre that happened at Robb Elementary. In just a few minutes, we're going to be meeting with the families who plan to hold a separate news conference here in Uvalde. In fact, right across the street, Lee Waldman and photojournalist Joe Arredondo are setting up for that. But we would like to recap some of what we have heard, some of it very heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely grueling details there. I think the biggest thing is, if you were just with us right now, an epic, complete lack of leadership and coordination. Several of the of DOJ officials, Merrick Garland, saying that there were major failures, leadership, preparedness. They went through a detailed timeline of everything, Ursula, and to hear those details, I mean, are absolutely devastating. I mean, you could just imagine. We were told that there were families in there, and obviously we're going to hear from some more families in there right now, but just devastating details there.
Some of the things that we have kind of talked about over the last year and a half or so. Some of it we already knew. Some of this we did not know, at least not in this detail. And the thing that was just breaking my heart, and I'm sure it did yours as well. And in fact, you could hear Merrick Garland's voice breaking as he was describing what it was like to be a parent waiting to get news. And that was, as much as the failure of rescuing those children for 77 minutes in those two classrooms, what was going on outside and the aftermath with the poor parents, it's a gut punch. That's the only way I can put it.
Yeah, that's right, Ursula. I remember the videos that surfaced in the midst of this shooting where there were parents just anguished, just trying to get any information from what had happened in the school, trying to get information on their loved ones. The report says failures, among other things, leadership, but just the coordination and the communication in the aftermath of the shooting. Apparently, there were parents that were trying to get to hospitals, but they were facing obstacles when it came to that. I mean, you could just imagine just that feeling, that sense of just not knowing what was going on, and the understanding of this is something completely terrible.
And some of the information that you're talking about was just plain old incorrect. So they were passing on information to parents and bystanders, and what they were doing with the victims after they had rescued them. For instance, the triage plan did not even exist. They had 33 or so victims who had gunshot wounds. Some of the victims who had been shot were put on school buses without any medical care. One was placed on the sidewalk where she died, and dead victims were put in the ambulances and taken to hospitals. So none of it made any sense to anyone. And as well as the parents were waiting outside for the information, they were sent to 3 different locations just randomly around town to try to get information. And some of them only found out that their child had died when someone walked up to them and handed them a request for an autopsy. Can you just imagine?
Gripping, just brutal details there. Something else that stood out to me, Ursula, was that obviously the Attorney General there went through the detailed timeline of events. And we've heard about the 77 minutes that it took from when officers responded to go into the classroom. What really kind of got me was that there were all sorts of these plans to try and get into the classroom, even some in the report that says that they were looking for a drone or possibly a sniper to try and shoot this gunman. And once the law enforcement entered the classroom, it took them 2 minutes to take down the gunman, whereas they waited 75 minutes. Once they entered the classroom, it took them just 2 minutes. And they were hearing shots from the classroom. There were students, there were teachers that were just calling they could hear law enforcement officials in the hallway outside the door. I mean, just a complete disarray there.
As they said, just an utter failure. And this report is quite extensive. As we said, it's 600 pages. They interviewed hundreds of people. They spent months on site trying to recreate what happened there. And at the end of the day, what they're saying is that it was just such a monumental series of failures, ranging from leadership, lack thereof, lack of preparedness, lack of policy. They had no critical incident plan other than a template that they kept on file that actually could not be adapted to their school, the way the school was set up. So no one had even really looked into the possibility that they might have to act in a certain way in order to save their own school.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of bounce off of that, one thing that Department of Justice officials also said, that the most significant failure here was that they treated the gunman as a barricaded subject as opposed to an active shooter. They did identify former District Police Chief Pete Arredondo as the de facto on-scene commander. So now, Ursula, we're going to hear from the families in response to this press conference.
Koskoff. And I'm one of the attorneys who is honored, maybe the wrong word, but who is representing with the gravest of concerns these families along with my wonderful co-counsel, Aaron Rogiers. Aaron, spell your name.
Rogiers.
And so Aaron and I, we've been asked by 17 families, 16 of whom have lost children, to investigate and evaluate potential legal action. And in a moment, we'll turn to the families and they'll tell you what their response is to what they've learned and what they're still learning. Understand that the report has not been made available but for about an hour or two, and it is voluminous, as you've heard. So most of our reaction is really based on what we heard from the Attorney General and his team last night. And so I want to talk about three things. The first thing I want to say is that the families appreciate the Attorney General's commitment to seeing this investigation through. For families in this situation, transparency and comfort and knowing that your government or your state is listening to you and are concerned about what you and your families went through is critically important. They haven't gotten a lot of that from the state of Texas, so for them, that is very much appreciated. And it was clear not just that the DOJ has taken this investigation very seriously, but that the Attorney General himself, I think you saw it, has expressed great empathy, and that's also very appreciated by the families. There are limitations, though. These families didn't need a 400 or 500-page government report to learn that law enforcement failed them in a historic way. They didn't need the report to tell them that law enforcement violated its most sacred responsibility, and that is to protect our children in a time of great need. They didn't need that. Why didn't they need that? Because they were there. Some had AR-15s pointed at them as they desperately tried to help when law enforcement wouldn't. They were there as their children were being killed while law enforcement was paralyzed. They were there. So they did not need to learn that. But the details of the investigation will come out for whatever value they provide. It's important to understand go back and let's just refresh our recollection about what happened that day. Within minutes, really, hundreds of heavily armed law enforcement officers were there from all different agencies. The DEA was there. The Border Patrol was there. The Uvalde police were there. The school police were there. The county police were there. Texas Marshals were there. It was a convergence of heavily armed and mostly very well-trained law enforcement agents. And you would think that they were fighting to protect a major army from invading us at our borders, as we would like our law enforcement to protect us. But who was on the other side of this epic battle? What were they afraid of? Were they afraid of an 18-year-old kid? This 18-year-old, let's remember, was about 5'5" or 5'6". He was 140 pounds, soaking wet. Were they really afraid of this kid? No. They were afraid of his weapon. And it turns out that even some of these well-trained officers are human beings. And guess what? We've learned from this event, from Parkland and other events where law enforcement got cold feet. These people were scared. They were scared because they're human beings, and they were scared of getting killed. And they waited around while somebody else was going to be brave enough to intervene. The questions that are not answered in this report are significantly more important than the questions that are. This 18-year-old kid was able to walk into a store down the street and acquire a military weapon, a Daniel Defense AR-15. And within about a week, he acquired another one. The day he turned 18, he had made his decision long in advance. In fact, he had ordered 60 30-round magazines, and they were delivered to his home. How did that happen? Where's the government investigation on how this kid got this firepower? The other thing that happened is he ordered over 1,700 rounds of ammunition from an online ammo dealer. How could that happen? How could that happen? Where's the investigation into that? How did this 18-year-old kid even know enough to know how to equip himself in this way? What happened? What are the means by which gun companies are marketing these weapons to our children? How are they reaching them? Where's the role of marketing and the gun companies in this report? There's no fault or investigation whatsoever. The truth is you can respond to an active shooting, but let's not delude ourselves. You might be able to save a few lives, but we can't accept that that's the best we can do. Over 12 years ago, or about 12 years ago, almost 12 years ago, after the Sandy Hook shooting, shattered families went to the United States Senate and they begged, they pleaded, they said to our elected officials, it's too late for us. Our children were just killed by a kid, a troubled kid under 21 who used an AR-15 to kill our children. They said, help us. You can't help us, but you can help us by helping others. You can help us by help. And Congress turned their back on the Sandy Hook families. And Congress turned their back on the Sandy Hook families. And because of that, and by the way, the Sandy Hook families weren't the only families to plead, to beg, to say, let's protect our children. There were other families. Every mass shooting that occurs, almost, there are families pleading with the government to do something. Parkland families said the same thing. They said, okay, how about now? How about now? Let's limit the access to these weapons to children, to kids 18, 19, 20 years old. And Congress thumbed their nose at the Parkland families. And Merrick, the Attorney General, is here. He's done nobody can fault the Attorney General for his commitment to this or his concern for these families. It's very moving. And his entire office, and I applaud them in this effort. But the Attorney General wouldn't be here. None of his team would be here. I wouldn't be standing here. Most importantly, these wonderful families wouldn't be here, standing here, pleading, talking about what happened that day. You wouldn't be here. But if Congress had just listened, if the Senate just listened to the Sandy Hook families, if they had just listened to Parkland, you know who would be here? Eva Morelos, Irma Garcia, Zaya Garcia, Xavier Lopez, Amory Jo Garza, Jose Flores Jr., Aletha Ramirez, Annabel Guadalupe Rodriguez, Eliana Torres, Eliana Garcia, Rogelio Torres, Jacqueline Casares, Jayla Silvera, Jace Nuevanos, Lexi Rubio, Tess Mata, McKenna Elrod, Neve Bravo, Leila Salazar, Maite Rodriguez, and Miranda Mathis. Think about that. This shooting doesn't happen if our government had just listened to these families, or and not just our government, but if the state of Texas had just even done the paltry thing of making it, even raising the age to 21, they would all be alive. And isn't that such a small price to pay? Yeah. We're going to turn it over now. Sorry? Yeah. We're going to turn it over now to our wonderful families who would like to speak and express themselves. And I'll introduce Kimberly Rubio.
Folks, a few families will speak, and then we'll do questions at the end, okay?
Reading this report this morning, I read that Pete directed officers intending to gain entry into the classroom to stop. that no leader effectively questioned the decision and lack of urgency of UCISD PD Chief Arredondo and UPD Acting Chief Mariano Pargas toward entering classrooms 111 and 112, and that leadership can arise regardless of rank and title. I hope that the failures end today and that local officials do what wasn't done that day, do right by the victims and survivors of Robb Elementary, terminations, criminal prosecutions. And our state and federal government enact sensible gun laws, because Robb Elementary began the day an 18-year-old wasn't allowed to purchase an AR-15.
Most importantly, from what we've seen with this report, and I commend the DOJ on doing this, is that although there isn't every name of the officers that were there so that we can hold them accountable, because we have to do our own digging most of the time, there are names that are named. And it is time, because our community is so divided because of this, because they don't want to believe that the people that they grew up with failed our children and they stand against us. I'm hoping that they read this and they see Johnny Field's name, or Mariano Pargas's, who is a county commissioner right now, or Constable Zamora, who is running for re-election. There are names in there, and the community needs to see this, and y'all need, because the DOJ stamp is on there, maybe y'all will start taking us seriously now, instead of telling us to move on, telling us to sweep it under the rug, and not doing a damn thing about it. We need our community. It's hard enough waking up every day and continuing to walk out on these streets and walk to an HEB or drive to an HEB and see a cop that was standing there while our babies were murdered and bleeding out. It's hard enough that. But this community doesn't care, and I hope this makes y'all. I also hope that this lights a fire up under the district attorney's ass, because we know that he's not done a damn thing, and we refuse to accept that. Do your job.
Let's try to go one at a time and just introduce yourselves so they know who they're talking to. Where do we want to start? Shimon, go ahead.
Yeah. So just
let them know who you are, Shimon.
Shimon Program, CNN. Just, do you guys feel that the report went far enough in naming people and holding people accountability? Because, as we know, the DPS had the largest number of law enforcement officials outside of the CDP. And there's a lot of video and a lot of information about their actions that day. But it doesn't seem that this report really touches on their actions, and it seems to focus mostly on local officers and Redondo issues. Are you concerned about that? Just maybe some reaction to that.
I don't see why. I don't understand why they are allowed privacy. My child, their children, they are named in this report because they are dead. Everybody should have been named.
Do you feel, Kim, if I can follow up, that somehow maybe DPS is off the hook on this when you look at this report? Do any of you want to just...
I mean, it's kind of hard to answer the question because we've only been given an hour and a half to kind of just look through the report. So we don't even know if they are mentioned in there or not. We would hope that they are because they were there. So we hope that they would be accountable for their actions as well.
Following up on that, Monica Madden, KXAN and Nexstar. I know that you said you're still sifting through the report and everything, but were you hoping that the Attorney General would have addressed a lot of more of the aftermath, the delays in the DA's investigation, DPS's investigation into its office's actions and accountability? Were you hoping that he would address more of that publicly?
I mean, of course we would have. We're grateful that we got what we have right now because it's probably the most updated information that any of us have gotten since May 24th. So we're very appreciative of what he's done right now. But yeah, we would have liked to have more information about it.
The other Jim Ryan with ABC Radio. Did you learn anything new from what you've seen in this report? Is there anything that you didn't know before?
We knew as families officers, just kind of talking amongst each other. We knew the failures that had happened. We just kind of, it makes more clarity now because it's written and now it's set in stone, and what we thought is true. So
I did learn something.
you did.
I didn't realize that the scene was compromised. The scene was compromised, so that there was people that shouldn't have been there that were entering the classroom. That's mentioned in the report.
And how did that make you feel to learn that?
I want to continue reading more when we're done here.
So a couple more and then we'll go read.
Two quick ones. These for WAI, KBB, and San Antonio. In all of your guys' mind, is there any question left that the DA should have all that she needs, all that she is required to have for her investigation to be able to pursue criminal charges now at this point?
Yeah, what else does she need? Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most extensive piece that we have about all of the failures that happened that day. What else does she possibly need to prosecute or to remove these people from their positions of power when they can't even do their jobs?
Yami Virgen, KBB, WOAI. How safe are the children of Uvalde right now?
I think the point of this is that none of us are safe. That's what Josh just mentioned. None of us are safe because these weapons are on the streets.
Sorry.
Well, the DA, even the DA, can't get in our way of fully in our way of an investigation. But it ought to be, to your point, it ought to be said that the DA, with the help of the AG here in Texas, is fighting the disclosure of a lot of this important information. So the DA is effectively, the DA has a job to do. We understand that, but she's locked up this information that these families deserve to have access to evaluate their legal rights. There's no reason why she can't do her job so that we can do ours, and so that these families get the information they deserve to make the decisions they have to make.
Can I get reaction? Timeline updates?
I mean, I think at this point it's not a good bet to bet on the DA's timelines.
Can I?
Yes, sir. Well, it's similar. Of course, the DOJ looks at the criminal, and the DA is looking at criminal allegations. But the other facet to these incidents is what went wrong, and how can we hold those people accountable? And the traditional other means that we do so, which is by bringing legal action against them, so that there's another incentive to clean up their act, right? And so we have to look at all the angles here. What contributed to this? And it should be noted that when many of us were growing up, maybe am I the oldest person here? But when many of us were growing up, we didn't have these routine mass shootings with AR-15s. But guess what? AR-15s were available. So something's changed. And so one of the big things that we've seen in Sandy Hook and Parkland and other cases is that what's changed is the way these weapons are pushed on youth. And this is a tragic and unnecessary example of the repercussions of that. When I was growing up, nobody knew what an AR-15 was, and here every kid of a certain age, especially boys, know what they are because they're being courted, and they're being courted with other actors like social media and et cetera. So these gun companies are really pushing these products on kids for these types of missions.
Can we get reaction from the Texas Tribune? Are you suggesting that you're going to pursue charges against gun manufacturers?
Well, I don't bring charges, but fair enough. But the legal issues that we're under consideration now I can't really speak about beyond just the big picture. type of things that you have to look at an incident like this. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into something like this.
For the families now, what are the next steps? As we now have one of these investigations out, there's numerous. The DPS is still doing their investigation. We obviously have the DA who is still doing theirs. What is next for all of you as you continue to try and move forward and, one, put the day behind you, but two, create change?
I think we're going to continue fighting. We're going to continue fighting that that some type of change is made in honor of our kids. We have nothing left but to fight for them. We are their voices now, so we're going to continue.
Can I just get a reaction from someone, the Attorney General, having him stand there, very significant moment when he says that lives, had officers followed protocol and procedure, lives could have potentially been saved. How was that? How was that for you to hear him say that?
I mean, how do you want us to react to that?
I mean, because so many people have not wanted to say that here, the law enforcement officials.
It was pretty hard. I mean, respectful for telling us, but I mean, it was pretty hard, to hear that when he sits there and says that, lives could have been saved. I mean, I just get a little closer to the mic. Like, I just couldn't believe it. For these officers to sit there and just not do anything, and still be out here, on the streets like nothing happened, And my daughter's gone. It was hard. It was hard.
I think we're going to leave it there, folks, and let the families
Excuse me.
a little bit.
Excuse me.
Thanks, everybody.
I got something to say. I'm the grandfather of Layla.
What you've been listening
I
to
use
are the
it that
families of the victims of the Uvalde elementary school shooting. They're wrapping things up over there, but just some of the heartfelt gratitude that the DOJ finally got something in writing for these folks. That was probably the overriding theme, but clearly not enough.
No, the attorney for the families there, Josh Koskoff, obviously saying that while they are getting this now in a written report, they're still seeking answers from Texas, the Department of Public Safety, DPS, and also the Uvalde District Attorney. I know that Lee has been doing a lot of reporting down there, trying to speak with Christina Mitchell, try and get some answers as to where their investigation is, and just get some answers for these individuals. You heard from Kimberly Rubio, Lexi Rubio's mother, Brett Cross, and Veronica Mata. And so obviously very impassioned, but something we were talking about earlier, Ursula, is just when parents were there at the Robb Elementary campus, they kind of reiterated the same thing here, saying that they kind of knew what was going on, and the inaction from officers there is really something that's still very crushing to them.
Some of them were counting, the lawyer in particular explaining, the families really didn't need this report. What they needed was an explanation. They were there. Some of them who were fighting to get into the school, to get to their child, knowing their child was injured because they had received a phone call or some such, had AR-15s pointed at their heads, while the 18-year-old who had an AR-15 in the classroom continued to hold court in there and continued to kill. They waited outside while no one inside was doing anything, and that's probably the most heartbreaking part of it all. Is they knew. They knew this was happening. They were given bad information. They were prevented from being the parent they felt like they wanted to be. And now the remaining question is about prosecution. A lot of these families are still waiting to get the names of the officers that were involved. They're confronted every day with officers on the street, and they're wondering, is that one of the guys that was there? Is that one of the guys that didn't act? And they want the DA to release a list of all the officers, because it was like an army out there. They want to know who was there, what was their job, give us their names so that we can do our own investigation and potentially get some prosecutions happening.
Yeah, obviously very heartbreaking news today. Very tough to hear that those details from the Department of Justice and the families there. Our Lee Waldman is on the ground, and she's obviously taking all this information in, and we will get to her coming up right after this break.
Live from KSAT 12, the news at noon starts right now.
Welcome back. We've been covering late-breaking news in Uvalde for the last hour or so, and the Department of Justice now finally releasing a report on law enforcement response during that deadly shooting at Robb Elementary.
That's right. Some very heartbreaking details included in that report, grueling details of what happened there that day at Robb Elementary. The sweeping report, more than 500-page document detailing what the DOJ calls cascading failures. It says that on that day, police showed, quote, no sense of urgency, end quote.
But it didn't stop there. It went into great detail as to all of the failures, as well as what we must do now as a country. Our Lee Waldman has been poring over this report. And Lee, I'm sure it was a gut punch to you, too, to see some of these details right there in print.
Right, Ursula and RJ, it's a huge document, almost 600 pages. And I'll be honest, I'm not all the way through it yet. We're still trying to take in all of what was uncovered, but it does reaffirm what we have been thinking for these last 20 months since May 24th, 2022, that the law enforcement response on that day when a shooter was in a classroom with children and teachers, that law enforcement response was an absolute failure. That was the message from Attorney General Merrick Garland over and over again today, and also by the Associate AG Vanita Gupta. Now, they pointed to some of those failures, and they also pointed to who should have been in charge that day. And they said that the de facto commander of that day was the UCISD Police Chief Pete Arredondo. They also pointed to the acting police chief for Uvalde Police Department, Mariano Pargas, and said that they were redirecting law enforcement away, making sure that it was a delayed entry, asking for things like keys, looking for SWAT as reinforcement when there was children inside of that classroom with a gunman who had an AR-15. They pointed out the fact that law enforcement was in that hallway when shots were fired out again, but they were treating this as a barricaded suspect. And that's what they said was the main failure of what happened on May 24th at Robb Elementary. Now, you mentioned how sweeping this document was. I want to give you an idea of what that was. It was over 14,000 pieces of evidence. That's documentation, that's looking over policy, that's looking at body-worn cameras, 911 calls, 14,000 pieces of evidence that the DOJ team looked over. They conducted over 260 interviews from victims' families, from survivors' families, from those law enforcement agencies, and they made 9 trips here to Uvalde over these past 20 months since then Mayor Don McLaughlin asked for the DOJ to come in. They're hoping that this is a sweeping look at what went wrong that day. They said they had 3 main goals in coming up with this report. The first one is to honor the 21 who were taken from us on May 24th, and also the survivors. There were 17 other people who were hurt that day and who lived. They also said that second point that they're trying to get across is highlight what happened with that law enforcement response, the failures that took place that day, and third, lay out guidelines for the rest of the law enforcement agencies across the country so that they know the proper way to respond if a shooting like this were to happen in their community. Something that really stuck out to me is they talked about Columbine. When the Columbine High School shooting happened, it took 47 minutes for law enforcement to go inside and take care of the gunman. After that happened, they, as in law enforcement, came up with protocols of response of what they should be doing if there is an active shooter. At Robb Elementary, it took 77 minutes for law enforcement to finally go inside and engage with the shooter and save the children who were still alive and the people who were fighting to survive those injuries. So the protocols that were set in place when Columbine happened were clearly not followed by the law enforcement agencies that were here today. We also just finished wrapping up listening to a press conference from some of the families who were represented by a lawyer here, and they said this also just reaffirms the fact of what they believed. And now seeing that on paper makes it more concrete to them. We met with some of the families last night after their meeting with the DOJ, and we'll have some of that for you later on this evening. But they said after almost 2 years and you believing but not having it affirmed that something went wrong and believing that law enforcement didn't act the way they were supposed to, you start to doubt what you believed your reality is. This reaffirmed what their reality is.
Yeah, Lee, something that stuck out to us, obviously, is we talk about that timeline there, 77 minutes, but they entered the classroom at 75 minutes and took out the shooter in about 2 minutes' time. So you imagine just had they responded much earlier. When the parents, the family members, hear these types of details, these types of information, you've gotten to know them, you've gotten to get very close to them. I mean, what do you think just kind of goes through their mind when they're hearing some of these just crushing details?
Well, I think what goes through their mind is, why didn't they act sooner? Why, when my child was hiding underneath their desk, or my mom was sitting there using her own body as a shield to try and protect her students, why didn't law enforcement go in then? Because it was known that there were students from inside of that classroom calling 911. They heard gunshots being fired while those law enforcement officers were waiting out in the hallway. And to remind all of you, I know we've showed that hallway video before, 376 officers from nearly 24 agencies responded to Robb Elementary on that day. And for many of them, it wasn't clear what was happening because they were told on scene it was a barricaded suspect, because those incident commanders, Pete Arredondo and Mariano Pargas, made it seem like it was that. They believed that either the gunman was dead or that there was a law enforcement officer inside of that classroom with the gunman. So there was a lot of misinformation. So I know these families hearing it again and again, that it took 77 minutes, it breaks their hearts.
I was just looking over the recommendations that were being made at the summary and the recommendations that were being made by the DOJ, and reading from that, it says, over the course of the incident, overwhelming numbers of law enforcement personnel from different agencies self-deployed to the school. Leadership on scene, however, had not established the command, the control. They did not have an incident command post. They didn't have a staging area. They had no clear perimeter around the classrooms or at the school. So anyone who arrived there did not receive any accurate information as to what the staging of everything was. And that added to the inaction. The situation of that you're in is you don't even know where to go because there's no one directing you anywhere. So that army of law enforcement had no clue where to go.
Exactly. And Ursula, I'm glad you pointed that out, because, again, I want to go back to UCISD Police Chief Pete Arredondo. He arrived on scene, and he was dubbed in this report multiple times the de facto incident commander. So he should have been in charge in setting up that command post and telling people where to go, what to do when they arrived. He arrived on the scene with a radio and discarded that radio when he got inside the school, was instead talking with people and using his cell phone to try and communicate, rather than using the radio, which could have provided clear direction to everyone who was coming to that scene. You know, we asked the Attorney General, we were given a chance to ask him 2 questions at this press conference today, and my first question to him was looking at the failures that are laid out in this report, looking at the 2 men who were dubbed as the incident commanders over and over again, Pargas and Arredondo, asking him, had they acted in the way that protocols were lined out after Columbine, could lives have been saved? And he said yes.
Another point that both RJ and I we're a little ill to our stomachs right now was the idea that after the event was over with the shooter, there was still a lot going on. You had wounded, you had frightened children everywhere. And reading again from this report, some of the children were reunited at the hospital, but other families got incorrect information suggesting that their family members had survived when they had not. And also others were notified of the deaths of their family members by untrained personnel who didn't know how to deliver that kind of, you know, the news that no parent wants to hear. They were being told it casually by someone who had no training in how to inform a parent that their child had died. It shows that even after all of this was over, the pain and punishment continued on for these families.
Absolutely, it did. They were told this information that their loved ones were killed in a school where they should have been safe, where they were 2 days away from celebrating summer break. They just had their award ceremony that day, taking you back to what that day was. It was a celebration. Their parents had been there with them just hours before they were taken from all of us. So hours later than being told at the Civic Center that autopsies are going to be needed to identify who these people are. That is not the way that you deliver that kind of news to parents and to spouses and to children, that the loved ones that they kissed and hugged that day weren't coming back again. So it was a cruel way to deliver that news. They also pointed out the fact that the law enforcement response was so scattered, ambulances couldn't get to the school to help people who were injured. And then once they were able to get to the school, deceased victims were taken to the hospital in ambulances, and kids who had been shot were placed onto school buses and then taken over to hospitals. That's something we told you about in our 1 Year in Uvalde special. And we heard from one of the bus drivers who described having injured children on her bus. And it's horrific to have that also put out on paper. A detail that really stuck out with me, though, is the fact that once everything was done, once the shooter was killed, once the victims were taken out of that classroom, kids were finally rescued from that classroom, those two classrooms, there was law enforcement officers who kept going back to those classrooms, who were not going back because they needed to do something for the crime scene, they needed to do further investigations. They were simply going to look at the crime scene, take in how horrific it was. And that affected the crime scene investigators in doing their own investigation and really drew out that process. So that was a new detail I had no idea about before reading this report. And I'm sure there's going to be more that we learn when we finally make our way through this very extensive report.
Some very seriously bad police work tainting the crime scene.
Absolutely heartbreaking news there. Lee Waldman on the ground for us in Uvalde. Thank you very much, Lee. We know that you're going to be very busy poring over this report, and we'll be on the lookout for your reports later on air and online. Thank you very much, Lee.
We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back with weather.